So I hope you can hear me. My name is Julia Reshe, and I'm Ukraine-born practicing psychoanalyst and philosopher. And I'm going to teach open course, Black Summer, How to Live While Being Dead, basically for all of those who feel that are dead and entering right now summer, and like all of us. And I will try to make this course practical to some extent, at least. I will introduce perspective of a depressive realism. I will also criticize this perspective, even though it is very depressive, but in my view, it's not depressive enough. So we'll take it to extreme. It will consist of 3 lectures, open lectures, live streamed, hopefully. First one today, we will concentrate on ourselves, us being depressed as individuals, as subjects. Second lecture, we'll talk about us, not individually, but being depressed together, how to create maybe, or how human bond exists, how it is depressive by itself, and how to deal with the fact that it is depressive. And the third lecture is about depressive world around us, nature, universe, as suffering themselves. And the last 4th meeting is the practical meeting. It's not live streamed, it's just to hang out and try to create a community or simulate a community of those who are living dead, if it's possible, at least to check if there is such possibility or experiment with such possibility. So today we're going to talk about suffering, not me, but each of us individually. Anxia, Corda, it's the suffering, anxious heart that is at the bottom of each of us. Julia Kristeva beautifully, in the introduction to her book, Black Sun, this is where the image and the idea of Black Summer comes from. She relies extensively in this book on this image. She elaborates on this image, which basically represents someone who is living dead, right? It shines, it is the sun, but it shines with darkness. There is nothing else to shine with for this kind of sun. And she explicitly explains and shows in the introduction that this book, even though it's the only time when she's referring to herself, she would refer to her patients, but not to herself in the book. But in the introduction, she explicitly shows that she is the one, a living death. She feels she's this melancholic, depressive, sad creature. She also refers to depression as primordial state or as primitive state of existence. Talking about her own daily sorrows, talking about her feeling empty. From time to time, making the effort to prolong the existence, but mostly plunging into death, living through death. So the course will mostly refer to this kind of human creature. In my view, it's each of us, but the difference is to what extent we feel it, to what extent we admit it, or to what extent it became a reality for us that we can't avoid, that it's hard to ignore. So the difference might be, for me, each human being who is melancholic creature as such, suffering human, the difference would be to what extent we admit it, to what extent we feel it, to what extent we feel the night of the soul. And this is the difference basically between psychology and philosophy. Not exactly, but still psychology would tend to different perspective in comprehending what is suffering human being than philosophy. There are some exceptions, both philosophy and psychology, but mostly philosophy would rely on this perspective, especially existential philosophy. And there are some exceptions in psychology. I just muted someone, I'm sorry. So psychology, this is the common sense of today's world. Our society, there's therapeutic society that relies, for which psychology is become a common sense. Basically, our perspective today, something intuitive for us, is that health at the core of human existence, the normal way of us to exist, something that we need to reveal in ourselves. It exists in ourselves, in our perception. This health associated with absence of suffering, absence of anxiety, absence of depression, absence of melancholy. We perceive normally, and psychology also claims that anxiety, depression, suffering, all of those are foreign to us. They are deviations from our normality. There is some normality in us which is associated with absence of suffering in a form of anxiety, depression, melancholy, and similar mental suffering. And then it promises, psychology, and it monetizes it, the promise that it can bring us to this normality. And philosophy, especially existential philosophy, would rather claim the opposite. It would claim that at the core of our existence, at the heart of our subjective existence, there is anxiety, there is mental suffering, there is not normal to humans, but something that defines us, something that makes us human. And health would be understood as absence of suffering, as some condition that is livable. Would be the deviation rather from this core, from the anxious heart of our existence. So it's the opposite perspectives that philosophy and psychology represent, even though there are some exceptions in psychology, and not all philosophy would claim that. Anxiety, in psychological perspective, this is taken to extreme, this definition, but it still exists as anxiety as something that is represented as mental illness. The common form of it represented the way it's represented by the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. But in psychology, there are recently, even in positive psychology, there are recently trends to normalize what is the definition of anxiety and the definition of depression. And depression is also perceived by American Psychological Association as defined as the most common health mental disorder, which is treatable, and therapy, antidepressants are recommended to ensure their recovery. So psychology persists that still the main claim would be that anxiety and depression, and it's a nice thing to think that way, right? That it's just a deviation. It's something that we can avoid. It's completely not normal to us, foreign to us, even though recently was the trends to normalize the depression, to say that it's normal reaction to normal human reaction, stress, anxiety, depression, in certain circumstances. And in contemporary world, not even in contemporary world, but in world as such, where there's so much more suffering people, it's unfair and very cruel to present depression, to present happy people, even not sure they actually exist, those who are examples of happiness, whose lives are examples of happiness. It's unfair and cruel to present them as, to label them as normal and to present them as examples the way human beings supposed to. It just makes it even harder to those who are depressed, to those who are anxious, and whose life can't be considered happy, right? My personal enemy is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is considered the current gold standard of psychotherapy, which is represent basically psychotherapy, psychology, the most popular trend in psychology. I don't like it because it's most obviously, even though recently again there are trends of recovery and normalizing this dark side of life, the grieving and melancholy, presenting them as normal parts of life. But still, the main trend in CBT would be claiming that depressogenic thinking is abnormal thinking. Examples would be, I'm worthless and ugly, no one values me, I'm hopeless, things can get only worse. So all the depressive thinking, all the pessimistic thinking would be considered not normal. And the goal of CBT would be to change those manifestations of depressogenic thinking into something more optimistic, something that is easier to live with. And another enemy, so basically depressive realism, which is also trend in psychology, but it's more like exception from the positive orientation of psychology. It would claim that, on the contrary, what is called in CBT depressogenic thinking is more adequate. It's not distorted perception of reality, but rather more adequate representation of reality. It started as a trend in psychology. It started with this paper by Alloy and Abramson, and was their experiment. They asked students, 100 and something non-depressed students and 100 and something depressed students, during the experiment to value to what extent the button, the lightning of a green light on a button that they were given, depends on them. So basically, the light on the button was just randomly switching on and switching off, and they have to evaluate to what extent the button, they were in control of this button. So it turned out that those students who were not depressed, who were happy, they were not adequate in evaluating to what extent the button is under their control, this green light. If they are pressing it and it switches on because they are pressing the button, or it just switches on and switches off randomly. They were not able to adequately evaluate because they feel they have illusion that they are under control, that the button is under control, and kind of more optimistic way of thinking. And those students who were more sad, they actually were much more adequate in evaluating the button, right? That button was not under their control. So this idea that depressive realism, the depressive perspective might be actually more adequate, even though it makes us sad. They started this trend, and another psychologist, Joseph Forgas, he took it further, and he, in his papers, basically, he claimed that sadness, maybe not clinical depression, but sadness has some certain positive sides. We can say, for example, it reinforces critical thinking, more adequate perception of the world. It reduces, which is also reinforcing of critical thinking. It reduces judgmental bias, improves attention, it promotes skeptical and attentive thinking style, it enhances empathy and increases perseverance. And happiness, on the contrary, is not that perfect, because the happy mood, makes people prone to stereotypic thinking. It's more easy, it's more, it's happily, thinking with a happy mood. We can't think about some negative things if they happen. We can't perceive them appropriately if we are in a happy mood, because we would deny them, right? And stereotypic thinking is easier. It's easier to remain in a happy mood while we are doing it. So they also more likely, with this mood, we are more likely to make social misjudgments because of our biases. And also happy people are more pleasant companions, right? Because they're happy. The depressive people are normally stigmatized. They're not that nice, and they're not saying things that are nice, especially because of their critical thinking. So, but again, for me, depressive realism as a trend in psychology, it's not depressive enough, because it still tries to show some positive sides of depression. It doesn't recognize it. It tries to give some meaning to our suffering. And suffering for me is suffering because it doesn't have any meaning. It might have some interesting good byproducts like critical thinking or absence of biases or some empathy, but suffering as such, it's meaningless. It doesn't make us better. We might use it in a way that we will evaluate ourselves as we becoming a better person, and we're learning from our experience. But at the heart of suffering at its bottom, it is meaningless. It doesn't have any meaning. That's why it's so painful. So it's still depressive realism, still the attempt maybe to ameliorate suffering as such, and not to see, to deny, still a denial mechanism to preserve ourselves from meaninglessness of suffering. Another interesting paper that I would recommend is Andrew and Thompson, The Bright Side of Being Blue, where they suggest their hypothesis, their analytical rumination hypothesis. And basically with it, they claim that depression is not like it's normally evaluated, the deviation, some kind of misadaptation in our evolution, something that went wrong with us in a process of evolution. There is this joke that humans are apes who are learned to be anxious, which is a bad thing, right? But for them, it's not this adaptation, but on the contrary, adaptation that helps us to think, that helps us to concentrate on something, some thoughts that are unpleasant and we would rather avoid. So rumination is thinking about something not pleasant over and over again. If we wouldn't have this ability to come back to ruminate, to have depressive rumination, to come back to hard thoughts that make us miserable, we wouldn't be able to think at all. We wouldn't be able to concentrate enough on some complex problems and to minimize disruptions that are necessary to sustain this deep analysis, or at least we won't be able to face some complex problems if we don't have ability to hurt ourselves, hurt our minds with it. But again, this type of depressive realism is still not depressive enough, because it gives, it glorifies in a way depression, that it helps us to think, like thinking is something that has meaning by itself. It's a good thing, still too positive. Renata Salet's psychoanalyst would claim that, so philosophy for me, psychoanalysis too, to some extent, they present more radical perspective in seeing suffering and depression, anxiety, melancholy as something inevitable and something important, as not only deviation, it's not only mental illness, but as a heart of human existence. And on her book on anxiety, she claims that she contrasts perspective of philosophy and psychoanalysis in relation to anxiety to normal perspective, psychological perspective that we are use today. So something within our common perspective, just simply something we need to get rid of, something that is just represented as an obstacle to our happiness. It's like we're supposed to be happy, it's natural for us, but there is this obstacle. We need to get rid of it. But psychoanalysis and philosophy has substantial history of discussing anxiety as something important, and maybe even the conditions through which we relate to the world, and conditions through which we relate even to ourselves. Maybe it is who we are, and if we'll get rid of it, there's going to be no us. Yes, we are living dead to some extent, maybe to different extent, but what if there is no other way of living? What is this is the only way of living. And already in ancient philosophy, Lucretius Card would claim that we'll talk about this anxious heart, Anxia, Corda. He claims that something that later existential philosophy would develop, that even though our lives are amazing, if we have comfort, we have fame, we are safe, we have honor, but even though, no matter how perfect it is, human would still have this anxious heart that nothing can fix, this torments of the mind that nothing can ultimately calm and make happy. So at the core, there's still this dark night of the soul, and nothing, no matter what we do, will not be able to get rid of it. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do it. Heidegger, after Kierkegaard, as someone who represents existential philosophy, would claim that anxiety would put anxiety at the center, would claim that anxiety is a mode of existence of the world. It's always there. It's always at the heart of our existence. Just sometimes it's repressed, and human culture, human relationships develop many forms of avoiding anxiety or putting anxiety to sleep, not seeing it, denying it, but it's always there. It's only sleeping. But sometimes, so we can't get rid of it completely, because it is the basic mood of our existence. And Heidegger would talk about, we can summarize Heidegger thinking in claiming that there are two types of existence, two modes of existence for Heidegger. In authentic one, when we dissolve ourselves in the way of the worlds, when we become same as when we just simply copy other people, dissolve ourselves in others, in customs, so we do anything to avoid anxiety, have non-critical attitude, we completely immerse into the ways of the world. And in contrast to it, there is authentic form of existence, individualized form of existence, and it presupposes that we feel anxiety, which challenges and secures the secure foundation of our existence. Anxiety is something that raises awareness of fundamental uncertainty. It helps us to become individualized, independent, and authentic. But again, even if existential philosophy is not as optimistic as other types of thinking, even though Heidegger, Kierkegaard would put anxiety at the heart of existence, but still they give this feeling of anxiety, they give it a meaning. Like you can see that with these two types of existence, it's still positive to some extent thing, this anxiety. It gives you something, it gives you kind of become a better person with it. But so it's still a denial of how meaningless it is and how painful it is. It's like an escape of, even though it's pessimistic philosophy, it's still to some extent an escape from this pessimism, because it presents anxiety as something positive at the end, or at least you can have something positive in exchange when you feel in it, when you plunge into the feeling of anxiety. Also in literature, Dostoyevsky was the one who I think started this pessimistic trend of thinking of human consciousness, of human existence as inevitably as something that inevitably causes suffering. He claims that in Notes from Underground, which is from 1864, claims that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. So consciousness, human consciousness, goes with suffering. And it's it's a great misfortune of human being, but at the same time we love it and we wouldn't exchange it for any kind of satisfaction or whatsoever. There are parallels that Kristeva shows between that possibly it is possible to draw between Freud's concept of a death drive. We won't discuss it today, maybe I think next time. Something that late Freud's start to recognize, that death drives our drive, a self-destructive drive, that there is something in us that doesn't let us be happy, that causes our suffering. And similarly, Dostoyevsky claimed that it's not true that we actually want that we want happiness, and that happiness is our natural state, and that it's possible to reach it, because we tend to sabotage it. We love, in a way, our suffering. It doesn't mean that we enjoy suffering. Enjoying suffering, this concept of masochism is basically, again, the mechanism of denial, because when you put two words together, suffering and enjoying suffering, it just doesn't make sense. You can't enjoy suffering. Those are the opposites. So the concept of masochism is in a similar way, the denial of suffering, it adds some joy to it. So here I wouldn't claim that love of suffering means enjoyment of suffering. If we want it, doesn't mean we enjoying it. It's like more, doesn't mean that it's something good. It's more like a tragedy that we don't enjoy it, we don't like it, but it's the destiny to repeat it to sabotage all over and over again. In art, probably the best artist who represents this position, depressive realism position, is Edvard Munch. He claimed, as symbolist and expressionist, he claimed that he draw with his heart, and this is from his diary, and that suffering, so he associates anxiety with something in a similar way to Kristeva, by the way, except for she's writing books and Munch is drawing pictures, right? So anxiety for him is his art. It's maybe an illness, but he claims that without suffering, he wouldn't be able to create. So for him, there is the direct, for him, art is opening his heart, and at the same time, art would be associated with suffering, with anxiety, with this anxious heart, we can say. And his famous picture, the Scream, the way he, in his diary, again, the way he represents it, the story of the Scream that we all remember, is that the screaming person, which is Munch himself, is depicted on the bridge. And the story goes that he was walking on the bridge with his friend, and suddenly the sky turned blood red, and he paused. He felt exhausted, anxious, and friends walk away, and he was trembling with anxiety. And he heard infinite scream passing through nature. And this, so Munch was directly influenced by Kierkegaard in the same way, similar way as Heidegger with this idea of anxiety. But actually, he was anxious himself, and he was later, someone pointed out to him that his paintings are similar to Kierkegaard, and after that he started to read Kierkegaard. He noticed the similarity. But this picture would be a great representation of Heidegger idea of going away from people, staying on your own, this process of individualization into authentic being, feeling anxiety, letting yourself feel it, letting yourself plunge into it. So you go kind of through process of individualization, and you feel it with all your existence, and you dissolve into the existence. Next week, when we will talk about sociality, our relationship, anxious relationship with others, and depression as a core of human bond, we'll also talk, we'll also rely maybe on Munch, because it's not necessary that we feel anxiety as on this picture, which is the most famous one, as something that goes with separation from the others, with disattachment from others, with process of individualization, but also the relationship with others are not less painful at their heart. Not only our heart is anxious, but also with others might be painful as well.
Među vreme slušam predavanje za anksioznost i depresiju.
Right. So, and the other thing is that normally with the Dostoyevsky idea, and later in a minute we'll talk about Peter Wessel-Zapfe and this picture of Munch, and what they represent is the idea suffering as something that has to do with specifically human consciousness as being overly developed, or just the appearance of human consciousness as something that is perceived as anxious, as causing suffering. It's also comes with the idea that humans are different from other animals, who are different from the rest of the nature, who is depicted normally as more harmonious, with less suffering. And I will also try to argue with this position, because in my view, and we can see it in Munch in his other pictures, but in this, not in this picture too, in this explanation too, that he felt suffering of the nature. He dissolved into the nature, into the existence universe, and because of this started to feel anxiety. So I like more the opposite perspective, that it's not humans who suffer because they deviate from nature. Maybe it is a world that is suffering, and we, as a part of it, might feel this suffering as our own suffering. And my favorite philosopher, Peter Wessel-Zapfe, is basically similar to this Dostoyevsky claim that human consciousness is overly developed, and it comes with great suffering. The very fact that we are conscious beings, and our consciousness, our minds, is mistake of nature. It's too much of overly developed. We ask complicated questions. We are reflecting of the unjust world, of cruel reality, and therefore we are too anxious, and so anxious that basically we can't exist. And he is also the most radical opponent of contemporary even psychology and psychiatry, with their definition of depression, anxiety, and the rest of the suffering as abnormality, as the deviation of who we are, and as a misrepresentation of reality. He claims in this quote that, I'll just read it, psychiatry even works on the assumption that healthy and viable is at one with the highest in personal terms. Depression, fear of life, refusal or nourishment, and so on are inevitably taken as signs of pathological state and treated thereafter. Often, however, such phenomena are messages from a deeper, more immediate sense of life, bitter fruits of a genuinely of thought, of feeling, at the root of anti-biological tendencies. It is not the soul being sick, but it's protection failing. So basically, when we feel anxious, when we feel depressed, it is because we have this deeper understanding of life, because we are plunged more into existence. So we feel ourselves better. That's why it's terrifying. It's not that our perception of life is distorted, but on the contrary, it's that protection from the reality doesn't work anymore. And we are too kind of realistic. But the whole thing was us being too realistic and too depressed. Realistic because we are depressed, or depressed because we are realistic. For Zapfe, it's all mistake of nature. So basically humans are those who are not supposed to exist. And I also found a meme that, sorry if person who is watching this, if I stole it from you. This is the idea that meditation is easy. Just observe what is in your head, and the voice in my head is normally this. The idea here is the more, and you can do this experiment at home, which is not good for your mental health. The more we ruminate, the deeper we go in our thinking, the more we are, the less we are distracted from ourselves, the more depressed we become, the more hard it's to sustain. That's why we tend to run away from ourselves. We tend to not to go too deep into ourselves, not to ruminate, to escape. Because if we don't escape, if we do this kind of meditation, it's getting more and more terrified. We reach, the more we are inside of ourselves, the more the closer we are to this night, the dark night of the soul, the depressive state, the anxious state of our existence. Zapfe, who claimed, my favorite philosopher, who claimed that human consciousness is a biological paradox and absurdity and humans not supposed to exist, he offers some defense, not that he offers some defense mechanisms, but he claims that all human activity, because we are this mistake of nature, whatever we do, we can't get rid of our suffering, but each our activity represents different forms of escaping suffering. And if we wouldn't develop those forms of escape, those defense denial mechanism, we would basically disappear. We won't be able to exist. And sometimes we do have suicidal modes when we face reality, when reality becomes too painful for us, when we not able to deny anything, we're not able to be optimistic anymore. So those defense mechanisms are some of them. There are actually 4, but here there are 3. So isolation, what we do to avoid it, to kind of extend our suffering instead of just committing suicide. We isolate from our consciousness and this disturbing, destructive thoughts and feelings that we discover within our anxious heart if we stay too much with our thoughts without distracting ourselves from them. And anchoring is anything that can give meaning to suffering. That's something that gives meaning to our life, something we can dedicate ourselves for, and something that helps us to see ourselves as useful and our lives as not meaningless. This might be God, this might be religion, society, morality, fate, anything. Something that gives us idea that we're not useless and our suffering is not meaningless, even though it is meaningless. But as long as we maintain illusion that it is not, then we are fine. Zapfe's favorite one was sublimation. It's not exactly Freudian sublimation, but something similar. When we are not, this is what artists do and what philosophy does and literature does. When we're not able to escape, to isolate ourselves from depressive thoughts, we might transform it into a form of philosophy, form of literature, and form of art. So when there is nothing left except for depression, melancholy, we can work with it as the form for something. And this was Zapfe's mechanism. He had myths of defense mechanism. This was also Kristeva's. It is still Kristeva's mechanism and Munch mechanism. So those are example of people, artists, philosophers who basically use sublimation as the final defense mechanism. And there is no way for you to escape it anymore. At least you can talk about it. You can teach course on it, and you can create art based on this feeling. Let's maybe start to talk about Freud and proceed next time also with Freud, but pay more attention to his concept of a death drive. And today I'll just show the dark side of Freud, the way he was pessimistic and somewhat similar to in his singing to Peter Wessel-Zapfe. He also claims in Civilization, that was published 3 years earlier than Zapfe's essay, he claims that our possibilities of happiness are restricted. There are existential constrict because of our constitution, because of the constraints of our existence. We are not able to be happy, even though for Freud, he kind of has two understanding of what are human beings, and the one he relies on here is the human being of a pleasure principle, the one that wants to be happy. But there is also contradictory other understanding of humans, more pessimistic humans of a death drive, that don't want to be happy. Maybe they want to be happy, or they think they do, but there is something traumatic in them that repeats and sabotages the possible happiness. So basically, we are not able to be happy. And this quote more or less follows the logic of discourse, because he talks about those three directions of a suffering. From within our body, we can add from within our mind, suffering that we feel because body is dying every day. It's this solution, and we feel pain, anxiety as warning signs, and also it's not only warning signs for our body, but also for just dangerous from reality. But also, maybe we'll talk next time how anxiety is in this way structural for sociality, how we can only relate to others, how social pain is necessary to constitute a social bond with others, in a similar way that anxiety kind of protects us from some dangers, or physical pain protects us from the dangerous conditions. In the same way, social pain, the way it's called in neurobiology, social cognitive neurobiology, protects us and constitutes the social bond, our relation to others. So the second one, but actually we're going to talk about it at the last lecture. Here, second one is the pain from external world, something that can destroy us, something that is doesn't care about us, something that can cause destruction, and relation to others, which are, according to Freud, the most painful one, and there is nothing we can do about it. So because it's the most painful one, we'll talk about it next week. He also claims that, again, depressive realist, in the way that he shows that life is very, very hard. And especially later Freud, who become more pessimistic, he claims that happiness is impossible task. In order to bear life, we need to have those palliative measures. We need to have auxiliary constructions, something similar to Zapfe defense mechanism. We can't, life is too hard. We need to have commit some palliative measures to sustain it. And what Freud offers in Civilization is sublimation, meaning that there are ways that can substitute us the impossible happiness, that is physical, intellectual, mostly intellectual work, as for example, for which is artist's joy in creating, scientists solving problems or discovering truths. And unfortunately, Freud claims that for intellectual work, which is the best, and artist's joy, in creating, for this, unfortunately, people have to have certain dispositions and talents. But for the rest of us, we can always find ordinary professional work and just try to avert our suffering, relying on it. And also there is the simple way that we now all maybe the central of our treatment of mental suffering, something similar to intoxication, substances, antidepressants might be considered something like that. So here the basic is idea that we can just become insensitive to the suffering using some substances. And also Eastern idea of killing all of the instincts, numbing our body so we can feel suffering, just learning, understanding that it's us who feeling suffering, our body, mind that feels suffering, and using some substances and some practices, we can just stop feeling it. Freud also mentions that our body themselves work in a similar way when we sometimes become numb and not able to feel anything. Freud also offers two other types of methods of averting suffering. He's not very consistent, but still, he claims that it's also possible to keep oneself from other people, voluntary isolation, not to let them hurt you or world hurt you. And this would give us a happiness of quietness. I'm not sure it's happiness of quietness. It's rather not happiness, but just a more peaceful state. But it, as alternative to it, and for Freud, it's a much better alternative, is what is normally Freud is known for this advice in pop psychology, it's to love and to work. He claimed that the more preferable way of looking for happiness and never finding it is to orient your existence, make love the center of everything, and that would bring happiness. But at the same time, we don't tend not to do it, because it also, the dark side of it, that we are defenseless when we in love against suffering. And it comes with a contrast of a deepest unhappiness, because this is a fragile state, right? And work, again, depending on your talent, because it's a defense mechanism, it's a way to distract yourself, and it's also a way to make yourself a part of society, and to be recognized by society, and to communicate with society, be part of it in some meaningful way. So basically, those are also all defense mechanisms. And it can be claimed that to some extent psychoanalysis is something that enables human to love and to work. But again, I wouldn't be sure about it. So we have some time. Thank you so much for listening to me. We have some time for questions and answers. We'll better stop sharing it.
Why am I there?
I do have questions or answers or anything else.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, sorry, wait, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. And I liked hearing the references to the dark night of the soul, because I think that a lot of people don't get the dark night of the soul. And I think that you do. I think that there is part of me, I remember years ago, I went to a medieval monastery, and I went there, and the coffins, the stone cast sarcophaguses, were all covered in like morbid, deathly carvings, like, you know, like the figures were rotting. And I asked my tutor, what? This is really bad. I mean, it was a Christian society. Why have they put this here? And they said, well, you know, the way they related to death, you know, it wasn't the way that we relate to death. The way that we see death now, it's pathologized. The way we see most things, most humans' emotions, everything has been pathologized with this sort of language of happiness. And as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing that back then, obviously, the language of death and suffering, they're all teleologically grounded in a transcendent reality. But we've lost the language of death, or a way of being able to deal with death and suffering. It's all pathologized. And my question is like, as you're talking, this return to Freud and Zappa, and what do you think that there will be, or can we recover a type of language of suffering that allows us to suffer well and not, without any aiming at happiness or anything like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The other extreme, thank you, Mark. The other extreme would be to pathologize happiness, and we have to be also careful with it, me especially, just for the future, remind me, because both are, we only know suffering if you think about it on a contrast with suffering, and we only know suffering in a contrast. So we're destined to happiness too, right? To some extent, to some rest from suffering. That's why we are still alive, because we had some rest from suffering. We're not dead yet, and
very true.
we call it happiness. So, but in psychologized world, it is maybe too much emphasis on happiness and too much of presenting as this normal, which causes us to suffer even more, instead of being more realistic, I would say, and more like claim that there are the options we can get. Is not the absence of suffering or suffering. The options, a more realistic one, are just different types of suffering. You can suffer beautifully, you can suffer meaningfully, or you can suffer writing something.
I like the idea of suffering beautifully. I think that's important. We have to link it to aesthetics. I think that's an important thing to do. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, thank you very much for a really nice lecture. It was really interesting. It's given me a lot to think about. It resonates with stuff that I'm doing, but mine in the field of theology. And you struggle in that field to try and push happiness out the window. It's difficult. But thank you.
Thank you. Do you see apophatic theology as something that has to do with it? Is it, because for me, it is this dark night of the soul. You plunge into it, but in exchange, you discover God, you become a better person.
I think that there was an interesting meeting between Bataille and I think it was Henri de Lubac, or I think it was some theologian. If you read a lot of Bataille, he's very much into the apophatic aspect. And I remember he was in a meeting with another theologian. He said, yeah, that's right, but you don't go the next step. You don't get that return back. But no, if you with apophatic theology, there's different variations of it. If you look at the early apophatic of, say, Pseudo-Dionysius, there's very little focus on happiness or this interior growth and flourishing. It's not there. It's all about structure and delving deeper into God. And there isn't really any talk of the effective stuff. Later in medieval philosophy, you'll find that with the Victorines in Western theology, you'll find that it becomes much more focused on happiness, like this idea that the stripping away of all the intellectual faculties and everything, and you're left with this sort of overflowing, sublime feeling of God. That comes much more later, and then it becomes much more psychologized. The same stuff that you're talking about, Julie. And my thing is like, no, let's get rid of that. Let's stay with the Dark Knight. Let's stay with the Dark Knight and let's talk about permutations of it. And I think that what you said about suffering beautifully, I think that's a really interesting concept. I think that I want to be able to explore that more. Does that make sense? So.
Yeah, it's cool. Thank you. I always wanted to know that, to understand it. But again, we can't idealize suffering beautifully, because suffering doesn't have a meaning. It's not beautiful. You can try to make it beautiful, but not to not to go into stigmatization of those who are not suffering beautifully, you know, be beautiful in your suffering. It's like enjoy your suffering, or you're suffering because you're enjoying it.
But you end up in that masochistic thing going on, you know. That's you know, I think the idea you put the caveat as coping strategy. You know, it's maybe, but no, it's really interesting stuff, and you know, I look forward to the next lecture as well.
Thank you. It can be an option, suffering beautifully, or trying to
or suffering dramatically. It's also an option.
Yeah. Okay, Volkan had the question. Thank you, Mark.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Mark, for your question. I also have a comment to you, and also a follow-up question about this is, you know, how to suffer well. And then I mean, it's something I think I also thought about at some point. And then the idea of like, well, you know, who I'm relating to, of course, is in Byung-Chul Han's book, the saving beauty. This he talks about giving birth in beauty, and that's really interesting because when in order to talk about beauty, he talks about the ontology of injury, and that's like I think really interesting how it links and how he kind of gets to there because it's an interesting detour. And then what I wanted to ask you is well, thanks. And then what I wanted to ask you, Julia, about yeah, about what I read in book of Byung-Chul Han called Good Entertainment, where he creates this kind of dualism between entertainment and passion. And that's kind of very interesting because what he says is that entertainment is something that what makes life tolerable. Entertainment is something that makes life livable, and it's like it's when I think about it, I think about pop music with all of its pomp and glamour, which also he exemplifies. And then there's also like passion music where there's like art music where it's really difficult. And so that's like, do you see this concept of that you talked about today compatible in the way that because to me they're really like, you know, adjacent and parallel, and I see that as, you know, in a way different words for the same thing almost, because, you know, if you can look at the music and it's music, if you look at painting, then, you know, of Munch and others, then it's that. And so I feel this this parallelism. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think there are parallels because when Sappho discussed those defense mechanisms, claiming that it's all we do, it's very easy to use this scheme, this perspective to analyze any activity. And we can say that entertainment, pop music or something like that would be more like isolation or destruction, when we distract ourselves from something more hard to persist within. And creation of music at the level of art would be more like sublimation, when it's hard to deal with, when you transform not all people transform their depression, but some passion into art. And it's not necessary that we have to choose one as a defense mechanism. I think Sappho was entertaining himself too. He wasn't writing that much, so probably he'd deal with something else in between writing. And, you know, to sustain writing, you need to, and something hard, you need to entertain yourself in between to just survive and not to, because this is the hard mode of existence, probably can't exist. Even for Heidegger, we can't feel anxiety all too much, because at the end, we just too much and we disappearing. We're not just living dead, but dead people. And to extend this period of our dying and we probably need to be able to go in some light mode of existence, of our suffering, and entertainment helps.
Yeah, I definitely see also in the exemplified there, like the connection to small talk. and to rave parties where like people come together, and then that thing where it's like small talk or the language or that music becomes this kind of detached platform, as a separate layer, detached from the pain of the real world, and then people can actually have some good time being detached. And it's about detachment, entertainment, the way it works. And then about also like moral morality and so on, that address there. But what I was thinking about when you said about you just said before Mark asked this question, maybe you try to write something and suffer through it, and then and maybe like the complete opposite example of that is Kafka, who's like suffering all the time and is only living when
When he's suffering.
enjoying that, right? So that's interesting because it can be, everyone is different, and it can be pretty.
But it's like reading John of the Cross, and what you get from that is it's suffused with love, like love poetry, and love is not in that in his. It's not a type of happiness. It's suffering. Love is suffering. One dark night, fired by love's urgent longings. Oh, the sheer grace. He's what's it called? There is this language of suffering, but it's a beautiful suffering. And the idea of carving a space, the idea of opening up, and the idea of being able to create a distraction from meaningless. I think that there's two. You can have meaningful suffering and meaningless suffering, but I if you ask me how and where you could categorize them, I'd have to think about it more. But I don't know. What do people think?
Just a quick question, because just a quick question, because I joined by the end of the lecture. Why would you call the creativity as the isolation or escape? Because from my perspective, it's exactly opposite. It's the only way for suffering people to speak. Right.
Yeah, so Zapffe calls everything escape. Whatever we do, if you don't escape, we just die. So if you do something, we're escaping. But if you want, creativity would be less escape, but like less of escaping mechanism than the other. You're escaping it because you're creating something. It still has a product, the piece of art or writing, but maybe not escaping, but putting it into form, doing something with it. The idea is whatever we do, we're escaping, because if we're not escaping, we're not alive. We're not cheating. Also, I wanted to mention Kafka, that Volkan mentioned. For Kafka, I didn't know that before, and I learned that when he was reading his text, they meant to be funny, and people in those saloons were laughing at it. So it's very, very interesting defense mechanism. It's dreadful, terrifying, but people somehow laugh at it. It's a combination of entertainment and this sublimation and Zapffe side, when we put the anxiety of the world into writing, but somehow it's comic. Humor is interesting. Defense mechanism, especially dark humor. For me, it's also this kind of Zapffian sublimation, when we admit, but we're still able to just to laugh. We just physically abreacted, precisely because we admit in it, something like that.
Are speaking about what you talked about isolation, Julie, and the age that we're in, where isolation is, after COVID and whatnot, it's isolation as a specific type of suffering, and how we can deal with that. But I remember someone told me changing isolation into solitude. But that would just be another form of sublimation, wouldn't it?
Maybe. Why?
I don't know. Is that there's a difference between solitude and isolation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would agree. It's a little bit. There's a slightly difference because isolation, it can be chosen, and it can be you or someone can be put in isolation, but the solitude is something. I think there is emotions attached with solitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no idea what you're both talking about.
The isolation and solitude, it's a little bit two different things.
Okay.
Probably you'll see them soon.
Okay. The difference is unknown to me. Well, if you're talking about isolations from others, I think it's impossible because it's still we are as social beings still, there is more other when we physically isolated from them than when we not. So it's just different. Isolation is different mode of existence with others, but it still hurts just in its just two ways of suffering, both separate.
But what if you decided to be isolated? I mean, what if you decided, I don't know, just to isolate yourself from everyone mentally and physically and live somewhere?
Well, I didn't. It just I'm different in a different mode of connection with people.
I suppose where I'm trying to isolation from it is the effect of isolation as suffering is loneliness,
mm-hmm.
right? But solitude is ultimately difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about, well, it can, in this age of loneliness, of being alone and the effect of it, the therapeutic idea is like, oh, no, you don't have to be alone. You can try and find happiness and all these CBT and become a better person and reach out to people. But maybe there's a way of being alone that ultimately allows us to be alone better. And I was thinking, would that be, you can speak about that in terms of solitude as being ultimately different, a different mode of being alone. That was what I was trying to articulate. I didn't articulate it very well. I apologize.
But now you did.
Either way, that was my thought. It was a genuine, just a thought, a question I just wanted to explore. But that's all. Yeah,
we can also talk about it next time when we'll talk about social bond.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's it. So I'm overshooting. I apologize.
I have something in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this name, but
mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. He has a more recent book published that has an introduction about his life and him, and then his stories. So then there's an edition like that. And I don't have it with me now, but maybe it's online or somewhere. And it's really interesting how he looks at life and how the poem is structured, because he always about like love and pain, and that when I say like this, you really don't get the idea of like his style. But then it's a I don't know it by heart, but if I knew it could be cool. I could just tell you now, but I don't remember it anyway. So it's something I'll try to find for next time. But if you can also search for yourself, yeah, good for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Also, if there are no other questions or comments, I can let you go and suffer on your own.
Yeah, on my in my solitude.
Yeah,
I did want to say I really like the phrase that you used before, and there was a phrase that you said, I put in the chat, so doing something with suffering. I think that's a nice turn of phrase. But yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Make it with passionate suffering then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for attending today. It means a lot. I'll see you hopefully next week.
Take care.
Bye. You too. Bye.